"There it is again, your grace," the underfootman whispered, backing away from the terrace doors with the tea tray shaking in his hands. "The black bird. It has followed her from the chapel, across the yew walk, and now it sits upon the balustrade as though it owns Ulster Hall." The Duke of Ulster did not turn from the window. He had been watching the bird for a quarter of an hour, and the bird, he was fairly certain, had been watching him. Below, on the gravel sweep, his wife of 23 days walked slowly along the line of clipped hedges with her hands folded and her gray pelisse buttoned to the throat. She did not hurry. She never hurried. And above her, keeping easy pace, gliding from urn to the shoulder of the stone lion at the foot of the steps, came the raven. It was an enormous bird, glossy as wet coal, with a wedge of a tail and a beak like a blacksmith's chisel. When the Duchess of Ulster stopped, it stopped. When she went on, it went on. When she raised her face to the thin October sun, the bird tilted its head at precisely the same angle, and the effect was so exact, so companionable, that a housemaid at the upper window let out a small strangled sound and fled. "Shall I have Bardwell shoot it, your grace?" "You shall not," said Alaric. "Only the servants' hall is saying." "The servants' hall may say what it likes at its own table and nothing at all in mine." He let the curtain fall. "Set down the tray, Peveril, before you drop it, and send Mrs. Hallowell to me." The footman went. Alaric stood a moment longer with his hand flat against the cold pane, and something under his ribs turned over slowly, the way a stone turns over in a stream when the water has worn beneath it for years. He knew that bird. Not a bird like it, not a bird of its kind. That bird, with the notched third feather on the left wing where a snare wire had once cut it, and the habit of hopping twice sideways before it flew, and the low grinding chuckle it made in its throat when it was pleased. He had known it for 12 years, and until 3 weeks ago he had believed it dead, along with everything else belonging to the worst and finest summer of his life. Mrs. Hallowell came in with her keys chiming, and her mouth already set. "Your Grace wished to see me." "Sit down." "I would rather stand, your Grace." "Then stand," he said, "and tell me what is being said of my wife." The housekeeper's chin came up. She had been at Ulster Hall since before his father's death, and she had the courage of long service, which is a considerable courage and a considerable nuisance. "It is not for me to repeat foolishness." "It is precisely for you to repeat it, since it is your business to stop it." She pressed her lips together. "They say the bird is a familiar," she said at last. "They say it came with her from Pelham Cross, and that it has never once left her since the wedding. They say Sarah Kemp took a fever the same night it perched on the dairy roof. They say, forgive me, they say a black bird that follows a bride is a mourning bird, and that it follows her because it knows there will be a death in this house before the year is out." "And whose death do they favor?" "Yours, your Grace," said Mrs. Hallowell, with admirable steadiness. Alaric laughed. It surprised him as much as it surprised her. It came out short and rough, like a man coughing. "Then they are romantics," he said. "Ravens have followed the armies of the world for 4,000 years, and have never once been consulted about who falls. Sarah Kemp took a fever because the dairy flags are cracked, and the wet comes up through them, and I have told Rutledge twice to have them lifted. Have them lifted. And tell the hall from me that the next person who speaks of curses under my roof may go and be superstitious somewhere they are paid less." "Yes, your Grace." She hesitated at the door. "Her Grace is aware of it, sir. She does not complain, but she is aware." That, he thought, was the trouble entire. He had married Verity Lind in the little gray church at Pelham Cross with 4 people in attendance, and a curate who kept losing his place in the book. She had come to him with one trunk, a dead father's library in 9 crates, and a settlement so small that his solicitor had asked him twice, in the tone of a man humoring a lunatic, whether His Grace was quite certain of the figure. His Grace had been quite certain. What he had not been certain of, and was not certain of now, was whether the pale, quiet, careful young woman who curtsied to him at breakfast, and asked him nothing, and required nothing, and thanked him for everything had the faintest notion who he was. Because she had known him once, and he had spent 12 years failing to find her. He went down to her because he could not stay away, and told himself it was to speak of the dairy. She was standing at the sundial with her back to the house, and the raven was on the dial's bronze edge not 2 feet from her hand, and she was talking to it. "And you are a great deal too bold," she was saying. "You have no business at the chapel. There are 3 men in this house who would like to see you in a pie, and one of them has a gun." The bird made the low, grinding chuckle in its throat. Alaric stopped on the second step. 12 years fell away from him with a sound like a dropped glass. "Your Grace," she had heard the gravel. She turned and curtsied, and her hands came together at her waist in that folded, guarded way, and her face went smooth and pleasant and shut. "Forgive me. I did not hear you." "You were occupied." "I was scolding a bird. It is a poor use of a mourning." "It answers you." "It pretends to." Her eyes went to the raven and softened, and then came back to him and did not. "You have come to tell me it must be destroyed. I understand. It is your house, and the servants are frightened, and I have no right to." "Duchess." She stopped. "I have come," he said, "to tell you that the dairy flags are to be lifted, and that anyone who touches that bird will answer to me. In that order, because the flags are the more urgent." For a moment something moved behind the smooth, pleasant face. Not gratitude. He had had gratitude from her politely, every day, and had come to loathe it. This was closer to bewilderment. "You are not afraid of it," she said slowly. "No. Everyone is afraid of it." "Everyone at Ulster is afraid of me," said Alaric, "and I have never yet eaten anybody. Fear is a poor witness." That startled a laugh out of her, a real one, small and surprised, gone almost at once. But he saw it, and he thought that in 23 days of marriage it was the first thing she had given him that she had not first weighed. The raven took 2 hops sideways along the bronze edge of the dial and launched itself and went up over the roofline, and the Duke of Ulster watched it go with his heart going like a hammer in a forge, and said, quite calmly, "Has it a name?" He should not have asked it. He knew as he said it that he should not have asked it, that it was too near, that he had held the question in his teeth for 3 weeks precisely, because of what her answer would tell him. But the morning was thin and bright, and she had laughed, and he was not, it seemed, as disciplined a man as the county believed. Verity Lynde looked at the empty sky for a long moment. "No," she said, "it has no name. It is a wild thing that has taken a fancy to me, nothing more." And she had lied to him. He saw it as clearly as he saw the frost on the grass, the small pull at the corner of her mouth, the way her thumb pressed hard into the palm of her other hand, the half-beat of hesitation before the flat little sentence came out. She had lied, and she had lied badly, and she had lied because she was frightened. "Not of the bird." "It is cold," he said after a moment. "Come in if you will, your hands are blue." "I am used to cold rooms, your Grace." "You are not living in one now." He offered his arm. She looked at it as though it were a document she was not sure she was permitted to sign, and then she laid her fingers on his sleeve, very lightly, the weight of a bird, and they went up the steps together, while behind the windows of the great house, a dozen people pretended not to be looking. That night he could not sleep, and so he did what he had done perhaps 11 times in 12 years, which was to unlock the small drawer in the bottom of his writing desk and take out the thing he kept there. It was a whistle, not a sporting whistle, a crude little pipe of yellowed ivory, no longer than his thumb, with a hole bored badly off-center and a leather thong gone stiff and dark. He had made it himself with a penknife when he was 22 and had had nothing else to do with his hands. He turned it over in the candlelight. He had been 22 and thrown from a half-broken hunter on the Pelham Road, in the wet August of a year he could no longer think of without his throat closing, and he had lain in a ditch of nettles with his collarbone snapped and his skull ringing while the horse went home without him. And a girl with a horn lantern had come along the lane at dusk looking for a lost goat, and had found instead a young man she took for a poacher, bleeding into the ditch weeds. She had not run. She had put the lantern down in the mud and got her shoulder under his arm and walked him half a mile to a parsonage with ivy eating the gutters. And her father, who was very deaf and very learned and entirely unsurprised by anything, had set the bone with a wooden spoon and 2 neckcloths and given him small beer and a lecture on the migration of swifts. He had stayed 19 days. He had told them his name was Lynn because he was 22 and vain and did not want to be a duke's son in a parsonage kitchen. He had learned to skin a hare. He had learned that a girl of 15 could argue a point of Latin grammar into the ground and then apologize for it. He had learned the words to 4 psalms and the difference between a rook and a raven, which is chiefly in the throat feathers and entirely in the character. And on the 9th day, the deaf clergyman's daughter had come in from the orchard with her apron held up in a bowl. And in the apron, naked and blue-skinned and shrieking with rage, was a fledgling raven that had come out of a nest in the storm. They had raised it between them for 10 days. She fed it on a quill and a pair of her father's tweezers. He whittled the whistle so that it would learn to come, because he had read somewhere that a bird will answer a note more reliably than a voice, and he blew 3 short blasts every time he brought it meat, until the ugly little thing would scramble across the flags to him with its wings out and its mouth wide. They had named it Sexton, because it went about all day in black looking for something to bury. On the 19th day his father's man had found him, and there had been a carriage, and a great many apologies, and money pressed on a deaf clergyman who took it absently and gave it to the poor box, and the Duke of Ulster's heir had gone home to be a duke's heir. He had meant to write. He had written 6 letters in the first year, directed to the parsonage at Pelham Cross, and not one had been answered. And then his father had died, and there had been the estate, and the debts, and the mines, and his brother's disgrace, and the long grinding years of becoming the man the county now crossed the road to avoid. He had been back once at 8:20. The parsonage was empty and the ivy had won. Nobody in the village could tell him where the old man's family had gone. Deaf Mr. Lind, they said. Died, they thought. There had been a daughter, they thought. Alaric set the whistle down on the desk and looked at it. 3 weeks ago, standing in a solicitor's dim office in the matter of a purchased advowson, and a bundle of 9 crates of books nobody wanted, he had heard a name read aloud from a list of debts, and had sat very still, and then had said, in a voice he did not recognize, "Where is she now?" He had not told her. He had asked for the marriage through lawyers, coldly, correctly, and she had accepted it as a drowning woman accepts a rope, and she had come to Ulster Hall with her chin up, and her boots mended, and no idea in the world that she had ever met him. And now her bird had found her again, and the whole house was calling her cursed, and she stood at his sundial and told him it had no name. He blew out the candle. He did not sleep. His aunt arrived on the Thursday, unannounced, with 2 carriages and the settled intention of taking charge. "Alaric," said Lady Orinda Vane, drawing off her gloves in the hall as though disarming, "a black bird attends her. In the chapel, on the roof of the church at Ulster Magna last Sunday, where it was seen by the rector, the churchwardens, and 40 tenants. 40 tenants. They came out of that church and stood in the yard and looked up at it. And what did it do? It looked back. Then it has better manners than the congregation." "You may frighten your servants into silence," said Lady Orinda, "but you cannot frighten a county. A duchess is a public thing. If they decide she is unlucky, she will be unlucky, and every barren cow and drowned haymaking within 30 miles will be laid at her door for the rest of her life. I have seen it done to a better-born woman than she is. Have it shot. Have it netted and carried 40 miles if your tenderness requires, but end it." "No." "In the name of sense, why?" "Because it is mine," he thought. "Because it is the only living creature on this earth that can prove 19 days of my life were not invented." "Because my wife is fond of it," he said. His aunt looked at him a long moment, and something changed in her sharp old face, and it was worse than the anger because it was pity. "Oh," she said, "I see. You have grown fond of her. Dinner at 7, I suppose." They got through dinner. Verity sat at the foot of the table and was addressed 4 times, 3 of them as a rebuke and once as a trap, and she answered all 4 with such unhurried courtesy that Lady Orinda began, visibly and against her will, to be impressed. Asked what a clergyman's daughter could possibly have read, she said, "Rather too much, ma'am. My father was deaf, and books do not need to be shouted at," and Alaric had to put down his glass. Afterwards his aunt asked, sweetly, whether the Duchess had ever kept a bird. "I have never cared for cages, ma'am." "Then it is very strange a wild raven should single you out." "It is," Verity agreed. "Last spring at Pelham Cross a hen hatched a duckling and mothered it to the pond and shrieked on the bank an hour. Nobody called the hen a witch. They only said she was a fool." Behind his newspaper, the Duke of Ulster did not smile, and was aware of a sensation he had not felt in a dozen years. The desire to be somewhere with a particular person and nowhere else. The trouble came on the Saturday. He was in the estate room with the drainage plans when the dogs went off in the yard, and a woman's voice carried across the lawn, not screaming, but flat and level, the voice of somebody giving an order. He was at the window in 3 strides. Bardwell the gamekeeper stood at the edge of the shrubbery, with his gun broken over his arm and his hat off. And in the middle of the lawn, on her knees on the wet grass in a good gown, was the Duchess of Ulster, with her hands cupped around something black and thrashing. Alaric went out of the house without his coat. "It were in the snare, your grace," Bardwell said wretchedly. "Set for a stoat at the Pheasant Pens, I'll swear to it, sir, set Tuesday, and I never." "Be quiet." He went down on one knee beside her. The raven had got a leg in a brass wire and had fought it, as ravens fight everything, until the wire bit. It lay against Verity's palms with its beak open and its throat working, and its eye, that clever, insolent, ancient eye, rolled and found Alaric, and the bird went suddenly and completely still. "He knows you," said Verity. "Give me your scissors." "You will not hurt him." "Duchess, your scissors." He cut the wire in 2 places and eased the loop off with his thumbnail, and the leg was cut but not broken, and the bird lay in her hands and let him do it, and did not strike once, though it could have laid his wrist open to the bone. Nobody on that lawn missed it. Bardwell said afterwards in the servants' hall that the bird had lain in the Duke's hands like a christened thing, and that he would not care to hear another word about curses, thank you, from men who had not been there. They carried it into the still room. She would not be sent away. She held the bird while he bound the leg with a strip of lint, and the room smelled of dried lavender and camphor, and her hair had come down on one side, and there was mud to her elbows. He was tame once, Alaric said. Her hands did not move. You saw how he lay. A wild raven takes the eye out of the man who touches it. That bird was hand-reared. Many birds are hand-reared. By whom? How should I? Verity, he had never used her name before. It stopped her as though he had put a hand on her arm. You told me it had no name. She looked down into her lap, and the raven made its low, grinding chuckle, and the Duke of Ulster watched his wife's face come apart the way ice comes apart on a pond in March. One long crack, and then all at once. I lied, she said. I have lied to you every day for a fortnight, and it was cowardly, and I will tell you why if you will let me say it badly. A duchess with an omen following her is unlucky. A duchess with a pet raven whose name she knows and who will come to her hand is something a great deal worse. They would have said I brought it. They would have said I meant it. And I have nowhere to go, and no one to go to, and you have been kind to me beyond anything I had a right to expect. He will not tire of you. No, she said, he never did. Then she lifted her head and looked at him properly for the first time in 29 days. Not at his coat, not at his hands, not at the space beside his ear where a servant is trained to look. And Alaric saw the moment arrive in her eyes, and saw her fight it, and saw it win. His name is Sexton, she said. The still-room was very quiet. When I was 15, a fledgling came down out of the elms in a storm, and I carried it in my apron. And there was a young man staying at my father's house with a broken collarbone who cut a whistle out of an old piano key with a penknife. He blew 3 notes every time he fed that bird, and by the 4th day it would come across the flags with its mouth open. His name was Mr. Lynn. He went away in a carriage with a crest on the door, and he never her voice went. She mastered it. He never wrote. And I was very silly for about 4 years, and then I stopped, and then my father died, and then the bird was all I had of any of it, and then it flew off in the hard frost, and I thought it dead. And then I was married to a stranger and brought 40 miles to a great house I had never seen, and on the 2nd morning I came out onto the terrace, and it was sitting on the sundial. She stopped. Your Grace, I am not a fool. It has taken me a fortnight, and I have been afraid of being wrong. But there is a scar across the back of your left hand, from the tweezers, when he bit you, and I dressed it myself with my father's basilicon. And you stand a certain way when your shoulder is cold, and it is the shoulder that was broken. And you have never once asked me a single question about Pelham Cross. Alaric went to the window, and stood with his back to her and his hand flat on the cold stone of the sill, and found that he could not speak at all. I have got it wrong, she said quickly. I have insulted you and— There were 6 letters, he said. The words came out of him rough as gravel. 6, the first from Bath in the September, then Christmas, then 3 in the spring, which was the worst of it, and 1 when I was 24, and by then I had learned enough shame to stop. Directed to the parsonage at Pelham Cross, to Miss Lind, and not one was ever answered, and I concluded he stopped. It does not matter what I concluded. I was 22, and had never once been refused anything. And it did not occur to me, until years later, that a letter may fail for reasons that have nothing to do with the person it was sent to. "We left the parsonage," said Verity, "in the November. The living was given away. Father was too deaf to hear a congregation and the patron's son wanted it. We had a cottage at Cobb's End for 11 years, and no direction was left behind, because there was nobody who would have written to us. She was very white. 6 letters. I would have answered them the same day. Every one." "I know," said Alaric. "That is what I could not bear." He came back and stood in front of her, and neither of them looked at the bird. "I went back at 8:20. The ivy had brought the gutters down, and there were birds nesting in the study where your father argued with me about swifts. They said the deaf clergyman was dead, and they thought there had been a daughter. 3 weeks before I married you, a clerk read me a list of small debts against a naturalist's library at Cobb's End, and one stood in the name of Miss V. Lind, spinster, and I sat in that office, and my ears rang exactly as they rang in the ditch on the Pelham Road. You knew at the church, when you handed me down out of the carriage." "I knew." "Why did you not say?" There was only one honest answer, and he was too far in now to give her anything else. "Because you took the offer the way a woman takes a rope," said the Duke of Ulster. "Because you had nothing and I had everything, and if I had said, 'Do you remember the orchard?' you would have said yes, and I should never in my life have known whether you said it because it was true or because I owned the roof over your head. So I resolved to say nothing and let you be comfortable, and to be content with that. It is the only decent thing I have done in 9 years, and I have been half mad with it since the second morning." Verity Lind began, quite silently, to cry, which he had not expected, and had no defense against whatever. "Sexton," she said, "you interfering, thieving, sanctimonious creature." And Alaric knelt down on the still-room floor in front of his wife, and did not touch her, and said, "Ask me for the whistle. It is in the bottom drawer of the desk in the estate room, and it has been in every house I have lived in for 12 years, and I have never once been able to throw it into a fire. Ask me, and I will fetch it and put it in your hand, and then you will know." She wiped her face with the muddy back of her wrist, which did no good at all. "I do know," she said, "but fetch it anyway." The county did not care what happened in a still room. The rector of Ulster Magna wrote on the Monday, in the tone of a man tremendously reluctant to write, to say that certain of the parishioners had approached him, and that while he himself was of course above such notions, he felt it his duty to lay before his grace the suggestion that the Duchess might for a season refrain from attending divine service until the excitement should have subsided. Alaric read it twice, and then wrote back that the Duchess would attend divine service on Sunday in the Ulster pew, that he would attend beside her, and that if the excitement had not subsided by then, the rector might preach upon the 12th chapter of Job, in which the beasts and the fowls of the air are recommended as teachers, and he would find the Duke of Ulster listening with unusual attention. "You are making enemies," said Lady Orinda, watching him seal it. "I have never had any difficulty making enemies, madam. It is friends I am clumsy at." "You will make her a byword." "She is a byword. The question is what the word means." He set down the wax. "There is to be an assembly here at Michaelmas, as there has been every year since my grandfather's time. 200 people will come and eat my dinner and look at my wife. I do not intend to hide her from them. I intend to explain her." His aunt's brows went up. "Explain. You cannot explain a superstition, Alaric. You can only outlast it." "Then I shall try the other way first," he said. "And if it fails, madam, you may say you told me so at very great length." 3 days before Michaelmas, the river fog came up. It came the way it did twice a year in that low country, thick and yellow-white off the water meadows, blotting out the avenue by 4 in the afternoon, so that a man could stand at the terrace steps and not see the stone lion at the bottom of them. Alaric was riding home from the mill and got in wet to the knees at 5:30 and found the hall in an uproar. "Her Grace went down to Cobb's Row at 2, sir," said Mrs. Hallowell, and for the first time in 20 years her voice was not steady. "With the baskets, sir, to the Kemps and old Dunnage. She would not take the gig. She said the lane was too soft. Molly went with her and came back at 4 because her Grace sent her back with the empty baskets and said she would follow directly by the field path." The field path ran along the top of the water meadows and past the old lime workings, where there were 3 pits sunk 16 feet into the chalk, and a fence around them that had been rotten when Alaric was a boy and had been on Rutledge's list for 11 months. He did not remember giving orders. He was told afterwards that he had given a great many, very quietly, and that 14 men and every lantern in the house were out within the quarter hour. They spread along the field path and shouted her name into the fog, and the fog took the sound and folded it and gave nothing back. The lanterns made no light, they made a smear. He walked the top of the meadow with Bardwell and could not see the man's shoulder at arm's length, and at every third step he put his boot into a hole and thought about the pits. "Your Grace," said Bardwell suddenly. "Sir, stand still." Something went over their heads. Not a wingbeat, the fog swallowed wingbeats. A sound, a hard, flat, furious rasp twice and then again further off and then again. Alaric had heard that sound come out of a fledgling in a parsonage kitchen when the tweezers were slow. "That way," he said. "Sir, that's toward the pits." "That way." They went along the fence line with the raven rasping ahead of them, 20 yards on, then 15, then perched somewhere invisible and rasping steadily like a man striking a file. And then the fog thinned for one breath the way fog does, and Alaric saw the broken rail and the trampled chalk and something pale on the ground. It was a glove. Gray kid, mended at the third finger, and beside it, black as a hole in the world with its wings half open, stood Sexton on the lip of the pit with its bandaged leg drawn up. Alaric went flat on his stomach in the wet chalk and put his head over the edge. "Verity." A pause that took a year. "Your Grace." Her voice came up thin and shaking with cold and absolutely level. "I am at the bottom. I am not much hurt. My ankle is turned and the sides are chalk and I cannot get any purchase. I have been calling for 2 hours and I have very little voice left." "Do not use it." "He would not go," she said. "I sent him. I told him to go up to the house and he would not. He only sat on the edge and shouted, and I could not make him understand." "He was understood," said Alaric. They had her out in 11 minutes with a ladder from the hurdle maker's in Bardwell's coat and 4 men on a rope. And when Alaric came up the ladder behind her with her weight against his shoulder there were, by then, some 30 people standing about the lime workings in the fog with lanterns. His own men, and the Kemps, and old Dunnage who had walked a mile and a half on 2 sticks, and the smith, and 11 tenants who had come out of Cobb's Row when the word ran. They all saw the bird. It came down out of the murk while he was carrying her to the gig and settled on the rail of it, and rode the whole way up the avenue with its feathers streaming wet, 6 inches from the Duchess of Ulster's shoulder, and nobody said a word about curses. Nobody said a word at all until old Dunnage, who was 84 and afraid of no one, took his hat off and observed to the fog in general that he'd sooner have that bird than a pack of hounds, and he hoped her Grace would keep it in beef. On the night of Michaelmas, the great hall at Ulster blazed with 200 candles, and the crystal on the long table threw light up into the vaulting, and there were 206 people at dinner. and every one of them had come to look. Alaric let them look. He had put her in dove-gray silk with his mother's pearls, and he had not permitted her to sit at the far end. He had ordered the table shortened by 2 leaves, without explanation, so that his wife should be within reach of his hand. At the second remove, Sir Gaspard Fenwick, who had a red face and 40,000 a year, and no more discretion than a hunting horn, leaned across and asked whether it was true that her grace was attended by an unnatural bird. The whole table heard it. The whole table stopped. Verity set down her glass. Alaric watched her draw breath to answer for herself, and put 2 fingers on the cloth beside her hand, and she saw it and waited. "It is true," said the Duke of Ulster, "that my wife is attended by a bird. It is not unnatural. It is a raven, hand-reared, 12 years old this summer, and it answers to sexton, and it is at this moment in the old mews eating a great deal of my beef with its leg in a bandage. Since half the county is determined to discuss it, I had rather it were discussed accurately, and I have therefore brought the evidence to dinner, which I am aware is vulgar. Peveril." The footman brought in, on a salver, 3 objects, and set them down among the silver where the light fell on them. A small yellowed ivory whistle on a stiff leather thong, a linen-bound notebook, water-stained, closed with a tape, and a folded packet of 6 letters, sealed, unopened, browned at the edges, addressed in a young man's showy hand. "The book," said Alaric, "is a naturalist's journal kept by the Reverend Mr. Josiah Lind, of Pelham Cross, who was a fellow of 2 societies and deaf as the Michaelmas moon. It runs from the year 11. If any gentleman wishes to satisfy himself, he may read from the entry of the 14th of August, in which Mr. Lind records that his daughter, aged 15, had brought in a raven nestling blown from the elms, and that a young man then lodging in the house on account of a broken collarbone was engaged in the manufacture of a bird call from a piece of old piano ivory, with, and these are Mr. Lind's words, more confidence than skill. There are 11 further entries and 2 drawings. The bird's notched wing feather is in the second drawing. You may compare it at your leisure." Somebody down the table said, "Good God," in a perfectly conversational tone. "The whistle is the whistle. I made it. I was 22, and it has 3 notes, and one of them is flat." He picked up the packet of letters and held it a moment, and then set it down again in front of his wife. "These," he said, "are 6 letters written by me to Miss Lind over 2 years, which I have never seen the inside of, because they were returned by the post office at Pelham Cross to a house in Bath that had been shut up, and were found in the winter by a steward who had the sense not to burn them and the stupidity to put them in a box. I recovered that box a fortnight ago. They are hers. She has not read them either. She has been kind enough to say that she will read them slowly." The hall was so quiet that the candles could be heard. "You will observe," said Alaric, "that there is no mystery whatever, except the mystery of how a bird crossed 40 miles of country to find a woman it had not seen in 3 years, and if any gentleman present believes that the affection of a raven is a supernatural thing, I invite him to keep one for a decade and revise his opinion." He turned his glass slowly by the stem. "As to what is said in my villages, it was said, last spring, that my wife brought misfortune to this house. On Wednesday evening, in a fog in which 14 men with lanterns could not see one another's hands, that bird stood on the edge of a lime pit for 2 hours and rasped until it was heard. 30 of my people were there. Ask them what came into my house with her." He looked up. "I will tell you what came in with her. My life came in with her. Twice." Nobody applauded, because it was not that sort of room. But Lady Orinda Vane, at his right hand, set down her fork, and after a moment she reached across the cloth and took the ivory whistle up between her thumb and finger, and examined it in the candlelight with her mouth pressed thin. "It is very badly made," she said. "It is, madam. The hole is off-center. Notoriously." His aunt turned it over once more, and then she leaned forward past him, to the young woman in dove-gray silk, who had been called obscure and unsuitable and calamitous in a single sentence. "Duchess," she said, "I have been an old fool in your house for 3 weeks, and you have never once made me feel it, which is a rarer accomplishment than Latin. I should be glad if you would take my arm when we go through, so that 200 people may see me do it." And Verity said, "I should like that very much, ma'am," and did not look triumphant, which Alaric thought afterwards was the single most impressive thing he had ever watched anybody not do. Sir Gaspard Fenwick spent the remainder of the evening telling everybody within reach that he had always said there was nothing in it. The frosts came, and the year turned, and in the spring the terrace at Ulster Hall was warm by 10 in the morning. The Duke of Ulster came out of the estate room at 11 with the drainage plans finally signed, and the lime pits fenced in seasoned oak, and found his wife at the sundial with the 6th letter open in her hands. She had read them, as she had said she would, slowly. One a month, and no more, no matter how he pleaded, because, she said, they had waited 12 years and she was not going to gulp them like a girl at a fair. "Well," he said, "the last of them." "The last," she folded it, "you were unbearable at 24. "I was. You wrote 3 pages upon the injustice of never having been refused anything." "I did." "It is the best letter of the 6, said Verity, "and I have decided to be very angry with you about all of them for the rest of my life, in small installments, at convenient hours." Alaric came and stood beside her. On the bronze edge of the dial, Sexton the Raven, sound of leg and insufferable of manner, was engaged in stealing the wax seal off the letter and looking at nobody. "Duchess," he said, "there is something that has never been said in this house, and I find that I have grown superstitious about it, which is absurd in a man who lectured 200 people upon the subject at dinner." "Then say it badly," said Verity. "You told me once that I might." So he told her badly. He told her that he had loved a girl with a horn lantern for 12 years, without knowing whether she existed, that he had married a stranger in order to give a rope to a drowning woman, and had discovered that he was the one in the water, that he had lain awake for a month afraid to ask her a single question about Pelham Cross, in case the answer made him her creditor instead of her husband, and that he had none of him left that was not hers, and had not had for some considerable time. And Verity Lind, Duchess of Ulster, put the letters down on the sundial with a stone on top of them, so the raven should not have them, and took his face in both her hands and said, "You interfering, thieving, sanctimonious creature," which was not what he had expected and was, he understood at once, the highest compliment in her possession. The bird made its low, grinding chuckle in its throat, and went up off the dial, and left them the terrace to themselves. And the tall doors stood open on the warm morning, and after a while nobody was on the terrace at all. They kept him 9 years more. He grew gray about the throat and appalling in his habits, and buried 17 silver teaspoons in the shrubbery. And on Sunday mornings he sat on the roof of the church at Ulster Magna, while 40 tenants filed in underneath, and not one of them ever again thought it meant anything at all, except that the Duchess must be somewhere near, and that where the Duchess was, things generally came right.